The summer sun cast long shadows across the freshly mowed lawn of the Martinez family's new home. After 3 months of unpacking boxes and settling into their suburban dream house, they were finally ready to host their first proper family gathering. The neighborhood was picture perfect, with its neat rows of two-story houses and carefully trimmed hedges, but something felt different about this particular Saturday afternoon. James Martinez stood in his backyard, carefully arranging the charcoal in his prized grill, a housewarming gift from his brother. His wife Anna moved gracefully between the kitchen and the backyard patio, carrying trays of marinated meat and homemade salsas that would make anyone's mouth water. Their children, Miguel and Sofia, bounced around excitedly, hanging colorful paper decorations that swayed gently in the warm breeze. The aroma of authentic Mexican spices began to fill the air as family members started arriving. Tia Rosa brought her famous guacamole, while Uncle Pedro carried a giant cooler filled with Mexican sodas and his special horchata. Cousins, aunts, and uncles poured in from across the state, their cars lining the quiet suburban street. The backyard soon buzzed with life. Children chasing each other around the yard, teenagers helping to set up tables, and adults catching up on family gossip in a mix of Spanish and English. James couldn't help but smile as he watched his family transform their backyard into a slice of their heritage. The sound of traditional music played softly from carefully placed speakers, while the sizzle of carne asada on the grill added its own rhythm to the afternoon. He noticed a few curious glances from neighboring houses, but chose to focus on the joy of the moment. This was exactly what they had dreamed of when they bought this house, a place where their family could gather and celebrate their culture. Little Sofia, wearing her favorite yellow sundress, danced around the tables, carefully placing name cards she had made herself. Miguel helped his mom arrange bright paper flowers in mason jars, proud to show off his artistic skills. The whole scene was a beautiful blend of their Mexican heritage and American suburban life. As James flipped the meat on the grill, he caught sight of his reflection in the kitchen window. 20 years of hard work had brought him here, though none of his new neighbors knew the full story yet. He preferred it that way, wanting to be known first as just another family man, a dad who loved hosting BBQs and spending time with his loved ones. The gathering was everything they had hoped for. Cousins who hadn't seen each other in months shared stories and laughter. The older generation sat in comfortable chairs, nodding approvingly at the children playing traditional games on the lawn. The smell of grilled meat, fresh tortillas, and spices created an irresistible atmosphere that seemed to make the whole neighborhood more alive. As the afternoon sun began its slow descent, more food appeared on the tables. Homemade enchiladas, fresh pico de gallo, Mexican rice with Anna's secret recipe, and beans that had been cooking since dawn. James watched with pride as his family filled plates, shared stories, and made themselves at home in their new space. This was more than just a BBQ. It was a statement that they belonged here, that their culture and traditions could thrive anywhere. Little did they know that their peaceful celebration was about to face an unexpected challenge. But for now, in this moment, everything was perfect: the laughter of children, the warmth of family, and the pride of creating a little piece of home in their new neighborhood. The peaceful afternoon took an unexpected turn when Mrs. Wilson, who lived in the cream-colored house next door, emerged from her home like a storm cloud on a sunny day. She'd been watching the gathering from behind her curtains for the past hour, her frown deepening with each new car that arrived at the Martinez home. Wearing pressed khakis and a polo shirt that seemed too stiff for the casual weekend, she marched across her perfectly manicured lawn toward the Martinez's backyard. Her face was pinched with disapproval, clutching her phone in one hand like a weapon. The happy chatter at the BBQ began to quiet as people noticed her approach, the joy in the air giving way to an uncomfortable tension. "Excuse me," she called out sharply, her voice cutting through the cheerful Mexican music. "But this is completely unacceptable." The children, who had been playing tag near the fence, stopped their game and instinctively moved closer to their parents. Sofia, still holding her paper flowers, ducked behind her father's leg. James turned away from the grill, still holding his spatula, and offered a polite smile. "Is there something wrong, Mrs. Wilson?" he asked calmly, though he could feel dozens of eyes watching the exchange. Anna stepped closer to her husband, placing a gentle hand on his arm. Mrs. Wilson's face reddened as she gestured wildly at the gathering. This whole thing is disrupting the entire neighborhood. The noise, the cars blocking the street, and these smells. She wrinkled her nose at the aromatic smoke from the grill. This isn't that kind of neighborhood, if you know what I mean. A heavy silence fell over the backyard. Uncle Pedro set down his horchata, and Tia Rosa stopped mid-sentence in her conversation. The teenagers lowered their phones, no longer interested in taking selfies. Everyone knew exactly what Mrs. Wilson meant by that kind of neighborhood. "We're just having a family BBQ," Anna explained softly, trying to keep the peace. "We'd love for you to join us. There's plenty of food," but Mrs. Wilson cut her off with a sharp laugh that held no humor. "Join you? I don't think so. I'm calling the authorities. This is a violation of everything. The noise ordinances, the parking regulations, the HOA rules about gatherings." She held up her phone, her fingers already dialing. "This neighborhood has standards, and clearly, some people don't understand how things work here." Miguel, who had been helping serve drinks, set down his tray and stood taller, his teenage face showing a mix of anger and hurt. James noticed his son's reaction and gave him a subtle shake of the head, a father's silent reminder to stay calm. "Mrs. Wilson," James began, his voice steady and professional despite the insults, "I understand you have concerns. Why don't we discuss this reasonably?" But she was already speaking into her phone, demanding police presence for a disturbance in the neighborhood. The party guests exchanged worried glances. Some began gathering their belongings, while others moved closer to the Martinez family in silent support. The music, still playing softly in the background, now seemed out of place in the tense atmosphere. Little Sophia tugged at her mother's dress, whispering loud enough for everyone to hear, "Mama, why is the angry lady trying to stop our party?" Anna knelt down to comfort her daughter, while James continued to face Mrs. Wilson with dignity, even as she listed imaginary violations to the emergency dispatcher. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the yard, and the once joyful family gathering now stood frozen in an uncomfortable standoff. But there was something in James' expression, a hint of confidence that suggested he wasn't as worried as everyone else. He knew something Mrs. Wilson didn't, and soon, everyone would understand why. True to her word, Mrs. Wilson's phone calls set things in motion quickly. Within 15 minutes, the quiet suburban street saw the arrival of 2 police patrol cars, their presence drawing even more attention from curious neighbors who had started peeking through their windows and blinds. The blue and red lights bounced off the houses, creating an unnecessary show of authority that made the whole situation feel much bigger than a simple family gathering. The Martinez family's relatives huddled closer together, the joy of their reunion now overshadowed by worry. Tia Rosa quietly packed up her famous guacamole, her hands trembling slightly as she secured the lid on the container. Uncle Pedro stood protectively near his cooler of drinks, as if expecting someone to tell him to remove them immediately. The teenagers who had been taking silly photos now sat quietly at a table, their phones forgotten as they watched the scene unfold. Little Sophia clung to her mother's leg, her eyes wide as she watched the police cars park along the curb. "Are we in trouble, Mama?" she whispered, the paper flowers she had worked so hard on now crumpled in her tight grip. Anna stroked her daughter's hair soothingly, though her own face showed concern as she looked toward her husband. James, however, remained surprisingly composed. He calmly turned off the grill, covering the remaining food to keep it warm, and wiped his hands on his world's best dad apron, a Father's Day gift from Miguel. His relaxed demeanor stood in stark contrast to Mrs. Wilson, who practically bounced on her toes with vindictive excitement as she waited near her property line. "See? I told you this was getting out of hand, Mrs. Wilson announced loudly to no one in particular, her voice carrying across the yard. Finally, someone will restore order to this neighborhood. A few of the cousins' children began to cry softly, picking up on the tension in the air, and their parents tried to comfort them while exchanging worried glances. Miguel, showing maturity beyond his teenage years, started quietly gathering the younger kids together, distracting them with his phone to show them funny videos. It was his way of trying to help, to keep the little ones from being scared by what was happening. His father noticed this and gave him a proud nod, appreciating his son's thoughtfulness in this tense moment. As the police officers stepped out of their vehicles, Mrs. Wilson rushed forward, ready to launch into her list of complaints. The whole gathering seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next development. The music had long since been turned off, leaving an uncomfortable silence broken only by the sound of distant lawnmowers and the occasional car passing by. Anna began to speak quietly in Spanish to some of the older relatives, assuring them that everything would be okay. The worry lines creased her forehead. She had seen situations like this before, where simple family gatherings became targets of unnecessary scrutiny just because they looked or sounded different from what some people expected in their neighborhood. The afternoon sun was still warm, but a cool breeze had picked up, rustling through the paper decorations that now seemed out of place in the tense atmosphere. Paper plates shifted on the tables, and napkins threatened to blow away, but no one moved to catch them. Everyone's attention was fixed on the approaching officers. James stepped forward to meet them, his movements unhurried and confident. There was something about his posture, the way he carried himself, that seemed different now, more official, more commanding. A few of the relatives who didn't know James well looked confused by his calmness in the face of this escalating situation. But those who knew him better, including Anna and their children, watched with slight smiles beginning to form on their faces. They knew what was coming next, and Mrs. Wilson had no idea what she had just walked into. The first officer approached the gathering, his face hidden by the shadow of his cap. Behind him, his partner was already pulling out a notepad, presumably to document all the complaints Mrs. Wilson had called in about. The whole backyard waited in tense silence, watching as the lead officer looked up, pushed his cap back slightly, and suddenly broke into the warmest, most unexpected smile. "Chief Martinez," the officer called out, his voice filled with genuine surprise and respect. "I had no idea you lived in this neighborhood, sir." The officer's partner nearly dropped his notepad, and Mrs. Wilson's triumphant expression froze on her face like a paused video. James, still wearing his world's best dad apron with a few BBQ sauce stains on it, smiled back at his officers. "Officer Thompson, Officer Rodriguez," he greeted them warmly, using their names with the familiarity of someone who knew his entire department personally. "I was wondering when I'd run into some of my officers in the neighborhood. Though I admit, I didn't expect it to be quite like this." The confused murmurs from the neighbors who had gathered to watch the scene quickly turned into shocked whispers. "Chief. Did he say chief? Police chief?" The words rippled through the crowd like waves in a pond. Mrs. Wilson's face had turned an interesting shade of pale, her mouth opening and closing without making any sound. Little Sophia, who had been hiding behind her mother, suddenly burst out with pride. "That's right. My daddy's the boss of all the police." Her innocent declaration brought warm chuckles from the officers and broke some of the tension in the air. Miguel stood a bit taller, a knowing smirk on his face as he watched their neighbor try to process what was happening. Officer Thompson turned to his partner, trying to keep his professional composure, but failing to hide his amusement. "I guess we can cancel that noise complaint call, right?" he said, barely containing his grin. "I mean, unless you want to write up our own chief for having a family BBQ on his day off." The transformation in the backyard was almost magical. The relatives who had been nervously packing up their food began to unpack again. Uncle Pedro's hand relaxed its grip on his cooler of drinks, and Tia Rosa's famous guacamole made its way back to the snack table. The children who had been crying earlier now peeked out curiously from behind their parents. Anna stepped forward, standing beside her husband with a mixture of pride and amusement on her face. "Would you officers like to stay for some food?" she offered graciously. "We have plenty, and James always says his department is like a second family." The officers looked at their chief, hopefully, like kids asking permission at a candy store. Mrs. Wilson still stood frozen in her spot, her phone hanging limply at her side. She watched as the same officers she had called to shut down the party were now being offered plates of delicious-smelling food. Her face flushed with embarrassment as she realized she had just tried to have her new neighbor, the city's chief of police, arrested for hosting a family BBQ. James turned to Mrs. Wilson, his expression kind despite everything that had happened. "Mrs. Wilson," he called out, his voice carrying the same authority he used in department meetings, but softened with neighborly warmth. "There's plenty of food for you too. Maybe over dinner, we can all get to know each other better. After all, that's what neighbors do, isn't it?" The afternoon sun caught the badge on Officer Thompson's uniform as he accepted a plate from Anna, making it gleam briefly. That flash of light seemed to symbolize how quickly things could change, how assumptions could be turned upside down in an instant. The music slowly came back on, this time accompanied by the sound of surprised laughter and amazed conversations as everyone processed what had just happened. As the truth about James' identity spread through the gathering, the atmosphere in the backyard shifted dramatically. Officer Thompson, now comfortably seated with a plate of carne asada, shared stories about their chief with the fascinated family members and neighbors who had stuck around after the excitement. "You should have seen him last month," Officer Thompson said between bites of perfectly grilled meat. "He completely transformed how we handle community outreach. Started a whole program where officers volunteer at local schools." He turned to Mrs. Wilson, who had reluctantly accepted a plate but hadn't moved from her spot near the fence. "Chief Martinez here is kind of a legend in the department." The story of James's career began to unfold like chapters in a book. 20 years of service, starting as a rookie patrol officer working the toughest neighborhoods in the city. He had earned every promotion through hard work and dedication, building bridges between the police department and communities that had historically mistrusted law enforcement. Little Sophia, now completely over her earlier fear, proudly showed Officer Rodriguez her father's awards and medals, which she had insisted on displaying in their living room despite James's modest protests. "Daddy says these are just fancy pieces of metal," she explained seriously, "but Mama says they show how much he helps people." Miguel, who had been quiet for most of the afternoon, finally spoke up. "Dad never tells anyone about his job when we first meet them," he explained to their gathered neighbors. "He says he wants people to know him as just another dad first." Anna squeezed her husband's hand, knowing how much this philosophy meant to him. Mrs. Wilson's face cycled through various shades of red as more details emerged about her new neighbor's distinguished career. Each new revelation seemed to sink her further into embarrassment. His department-wide reforms that had made national news, his speaking engagements at police academies across the country, his recent appointment as the youngest police chief in the city's history. I had no idea," she stammered, looking down at her plate of untouched food. The realization that she had just tried to have the city's police chief arrested for a family BBQ was slowly sinking in. "Why didn't you say something when you moved in?" James smiled kindly, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Because I wanted to be James first," he explained, "just a guy having a BBQ with his family. Not Chief Martinez with all the baggage that comes with the title." He glanced around at his relatives, his officers, and his neighbors. "Though I guess that cat's out of the bag now." Taya Rosa, who had been quietly observing everything, finally spoke up with the wisdom that came from years of family gatherings. "Sometimes God puts us in situations to teach us lessons," she said, looking pointedly at Mrs. Wilson. "And sometimes those lessons come with really good food." The tension in Mrs. Wilson's shoulders began to release as a few people chuckled at Tia Rosa's words. The afternoon sun had softened into early evening light, casting a warm glow over the gathering that now included police officers sharing stories with teenagers, neighbors tentatively trying homemade salsa, and children playing together regardless of their backgrounds. Officer Rodriguez, finishing his second plate of food, turned to his partner with a grin. "You know what this means, right? Our chief makes the best BBQ in the department. No wonder he kept this place secret." The laughter that followed seemed to finally break through the last bits of awkwardness hanging in the air. As James watched his family, officers, and neighbors beginning to mingle and talk, he caught Anna's eye. She gave him that knowing look she had perfected over years of marriage, the one that said everything would work out just fine. And looking around at the unlikely group gathered in his backyard, James knew she was right, just as she always was. As the evening light softened the edges of the day, James decided it was time to address the elephant in the backyard. He gently clinked his glass with a spoon, drawing everyone's attention. The gathered crowd, a unique mix of family members, police officers, and neighbors, turned to listen, creating a moment of perfect quiet in the cooling air. "You know," he began, his voice warm and conversational, "when we moved into this neighborhood, I had a choice to make. I could have introduced myself as Chief Martinez right away." He paused, looking around at the faces watching him. "But that's not who I am at home. Here, I'm just James, a husband, a father, and now, your neighbor." Mrs. Wilson, who had finally taken a seat at one of the tables, looked down at her hands. Her plate was now empty, though no one had seen her actually eat. The food had disappeared bit by bit while she'd been listening to stories about her neighbor's impact on the community. "Mrs. Wilson," James continued, causing her to look up suddenly, "I want to thank you." A murmur of surprise rippled through the crowd. Even the officers exchanged confused glances. "You've given us all a chance to learn something important today. Sometimes our worst moments can lead to our best opportunities." Little Sophia, who had been sharing her paper flowers with other children who'd wandered into the gathering, piped up from her spot on the grass. "Does this mean Mrs. Wilson isn't mad at us anymore, Daddy?" Her innocent question brought gentle laughter from the adults, breaking any remaining tension. Officer Thompson, who had long since removed his cap and relaxed into the casual atmosphere, nodded in agreement with his chief's words. "You know, in the academy, Chief Martinez always tells new recruits that the best way to serve a community is to be part of it first." He smiled at the group. "Guess he really practices what he preaches." The gathering had transformed into something none of them could have predicted. Uncle Pedro was teaching a couple of young officers how to make his special horchata. Tia Rosa had somehow convinced several neighbors to join her in learning a traditional dance. The teenagers, including Miguel, were showing their new friends how to properly wrap tortillas. Mrs. Wilson slowly stood up, smoothing her chaquis with slightly trembling hands. I owe everyone an apology," she said, her voice quiet but clear. "I made assumptions, terrible ones. I let fear of something different make me forget what being a neighbor really means." She looked directly at James and Anna. "I'm so sorry." Anna stepped forward, touching Mrs. Wilson's arm gently. "You know what my mother always says? The best seasoning for any meal is new friendship." She smiled warmly. "Would you like to learn how to make my family's salsa recipe? I promised it's not too spicy." The sun was setting now, casting long shadows across the yard, but no one seemed ready to leave. Officer Rodriguez had called his family to join them. Other neighbors, hearing the laughter and music, had cautiously approached and been welcomed with open arms and full plates. James watched it all from his spot by the grill, where he was teaching a small group the secret to perfect carne asada. This was more than just resolving a conflict. It was building a community. Every shared recipe, every exchanged story, every new connection was laying the foundation for something stronger than fear or prejudice. Little Sophia appeared at his side, tugging on his apron. "Daddy," she whispered, though her whisper was loud enough for everyone nearby to hear, "I think Mrs. Wilson needs more of your special BBQ sauce." She pointed to where Mrs. Wilson was actually laughing at one Uncle Pedro's jokes, her empty plate in front of her. The evening had turned into exactly what James had hoped for when they first moved in. Not just a family gathering, but a true neighborhood coming together, learning to see past their differences and find common ground over good food and better company. News travels fast in small neighborhoods, and by the following weekend, the story of the BBQ incident had spread through every street and cul-de-sac. But instead of creating more division, it sparked something unexpected. People started talking, really talking, about what it meant to be a community. The first sign of change came when the elderly couple from across the street brought over a homemade apple pie to the Martinez family. They rang the doorbell nervously, but Anna welcomed them with such warmth that they ended up staying for coffee. Their conversation lasted hours, filled with stories about their own grandparents who had come to America with nothing but hope and determination. Then came the young couple from 2 houses down, pushing a stroller and carrying a tray of brownies. "We wanted to apologize," they explained to James. "We saw what happened at the BBQ, but we didn't speak up. We should have been better neighbors from the start." Their baby grabbed at Sophia's finger as she peeked into the stroller, and just like that, a play was arranged. The neighborhood kids were the quickest to adapt. The front yards that had been eerily quiet now rang with laughter as children played together. Miguel found himself teaching his new friends Spanish phrases while they shared their video games with him. The invisible barriers that had divided the neighborhood began to crumble, one friendship at a time. Mrs. Wilson, perhaps trying to make up for her actions, became an unexpected ally. She spoke up at the next homeowners association meeting when another resident complained about changing neighborhood dynamics. Standing tall in her perfectly pressed outfit, she shared what she had learned about judging others without knowing their story. "Do you know what I discovered?" she asked the gathered residents. "While I was worried about protecting our neighborhood's character, I was actually destroying its potential. Our police chief, yes, the same man I tried to have arrested, taught me that without even saying a word." Her voice trembled slightly, but she continued. "He showed me that character isn't about keeping things the same. It's about growing together." The impact rippled beyond their street. Officers Thompson and Rodriguez shared the story at the police station, and soon it became a teaching moment in community relations training. New officers learned that sometimes the best way to protect and serve was to simply be a good neighbor first. One morning, Anna found a stack of cards in their mailbox. Handwritten notes from neighbors they hadn't even met yet, each sharing their own family stories of finding home in new places. One elderly resident wrote about fleeing war in Europe decades ago. Another family shared their journey from a small town in the Midwest. Each letter was a thread in the larger tapestry of their community. The local coffee shop, where neighbors had once sat in separate corners avoiding eye contact, became a meeting point for genuine conversations. The barista noticed how people who used to grab their coffee and run now lingered, greeting each other by name and often switching between English and bits of Spanish they'd picked up from their new friends. Little Sophia's school project that month was about community heroes. She proudly stood in front of her class, telling them not about her father, the police chief, but about how he and her mother had helped turn their neighborhood into a real family. "And now," she announced with a bright smile, "Mrs. Wilson is teaching me to grow flowers in my garden, and I'm teaching her how to make paper ones." The transformation wasn't perfect or complete. Change never is. But there was a genuine shift in how people treated each other. The simple act of sharing food and stories had reminded everyone that community isn't built by walls and rules, but by open hearts and willing hands. What started as an attempt to shut down a family BBQ had instead opened up countless doors, proving that sometimes the best recipes include a dash of understanding and a generous portion of second chances. 3 months after the infamous BBQ incident, the Martinez's backyard once again buzzed with activity. But this time, it was different. The gathering wasn't just a family event. It had evolved into the neighborhood's first monthly community cookout, a tradition that had started almost by accident and quickly became everyone's favorite weekend activity. Mrs. Wilson, wearing an apron that read Salsa Queen, a gag gift from Anna that she now wore with pride, was teaching a group of neighbors her newly perfected guacamole recipe. She had spent weeks learning it from Tia Rosa, and though she claimed it wasn't quite as good as the original, everyone agreed it was getting better with each attempt. The secret, she explained to her attentive audience, is not just in the ingredients. It's in the love you put into it. She caught Anna's eye across the yard, and they shared a knowing smile. 3 months ago, such a scene would have seemed impossible. Now it felt as natural as the changing seasons. The kids had created their own little community within the community. Sophia's paper flower-making station had become a regular feature, where children of all ages gathered to create colorful decorations. Miguel and his friends had set up a music corner, mixing traditional Mexican songs with popular hits, creating a soundtrack that somehow perfectly captured their neighborhood's new identity. James, still manning his trusty grill, but now with several apprentice grillers learning his techniques, watched as Officer Thompson arrived with his family. The officer's young daughter ran straight to Sophia's craft table, while his wife headed to Mrs. Wilson's guacamole class. These gatherings had become so normal that sometimes people forgot how they started. "You know," Officer Thompson said, helping James with the grilling, "that story about your first BBQ here has become required teaching at the academy now. We use it in our community relations training." He flipped a burger with practiced ease, though some of the new recruits don't believe it actually happened. The transformation of the neighborhood went far beyond these monthly gatherings. The community newsletter, once filled with complaints about noise violations and parking issues, now featured recipes shared between neighbors, announcements of cultural events, and stories about residents' diverse backgrounds. The latest issue had a 2-page spread about Uncle Pedro's horchata, which had won first prize at the local food festival. Little Sophia had started a trend at her school of bringing different traditional foods for lunch each day. Children who once might have made fun of unusual meals now eagerly traded portions of their own family specialties. The school principal had even started planning an international food fair, inspired by how food had brought their neighborhood together. Anna stood in the middle of it all, watching as neighbors moved comfortably between different groups, switching between languages, sharing stories, and laughing together. She remembered how nervous they'd been about moving into this neighborhood, worried about being accepted. Now looking at Mrs. Wilson teaching her mother's guacamole recipe while wearing that silly apron, she couldn't help but marvel at how things had changed. The sun was setting on another successful gathering, casting a warm glow over the scene. Someone had strung up lights between the trees, creating a magical atmosphere as day turned to evening. Children chased fireflies while their parents chatted, no one in a hurry to leave. This was what community looked like, not perfect, but perfectly real. James gathered everyone's attention for the traditional end-of-evening photo. As people squeezed together, giggling and adjusting to fit in the frame, he looked at the faces around him. Faces that represented different backgrounds, cultures, and stories, all now part of one shared community. Mrs. Wilson stood right in the middle, one arm around Anna and the other holding up her prized guacamole bowl. "Okay, everyone," James called out, setting the camera timer. "Say BBQ." The resulting photo captured everything their neighborhood had become. A place where differences were celebrated, mistakes could lead to friendship, and the simple act of sharing a meal could transform strangers into family. It was a reminder that sometimes the best changes in life come from the moments we least expect, served with a side of understanding and a whole lot of love.